In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a legend that makes even the most hardened alien warriors whisper in hushed tones. They speak of a creature bound by chains that could shatter planets, stripped of voice, yet whose very presence commands the attention of gods and demons alike. This being, known only as the Reaper, was once human, a species most aliens considered weak, fragile, and utterly unremarkable. But what happens when the most dangerous predator in the universe is finally set free? What happens when silence becomes the most terrifying sound in existence? And what happens when an alien, in a moment of desperate need, calls out the one name that should never be spoken aloud? The galaxy is about to remember why humanity earned its place among the stars, not through diplomacy or technology, but through something far more primal. Something that turns the hunter into the hunted and makes the very fabric of space tremble with anticipation. Some chains are meant to be broken. Some silences are meant to be heard. And some names once called can never be taken back. Welcome to the story of the Reaper, where being human isn't a weakness. It's a warning. The arena floor trembled beneath Crix's clawed feet as another opponent crashed into the energy barrier surrounding the fighting pit. The crowd of alien spectators roared their approval, a cacophony of clicks, hisses, and guttural sounds that would have been incomprehensible to most species. But Crix understood every nuance of their bloodthirst. He had been feeding it for 3 standard cycles now, ever since the hegemony had captured him during the failed rebellion on Tarkos 7. Crix wiped purple blood from his mandibles and looked up at the viewing boxes where the wealthy elite of a dozen species observed the carnage below. His 4 eyes could pick out the delicate features of the ethereal lords, beings of pure energy who fed on strong emotions. Beside them sat the hulking bruiser delegates, their rocky hides scarred from countless battles of their own. Further along, he spotted the insectoid hive queens, their antennae twitching with excitement as they calculated betting odds through their neural networks. But there was one box that always remained empty. One section that the arena's AI announced as reserved for special exhibition whenever the seating charts were displayed. Crix had wondered about it during his first few fights, but after dozens of victories and even more opponents turned into bloody pulp beneath his claws, he had stopped caring about mysteries that didn't affect his survival. Today felt different, though. The energy in the arena was strange, charged with an anticipation that went beyond the usual pre-fight excitement. Even the guards seemed nervous, their usual swagger replaced with sharp, darting glances toward the empty box. When the arena's massive doors groaned open to reveal his next challenger, Crix understood why. The creature that emerged made every sound in the arena die away to absolute silence. It stood on 2 legs like many species, but there was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions. Too tall, too lean, with joints that bent in ways that suggested both fragility and hidden strength. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched over a frame that looked like it might snap in a strong wind. But it was the bindings that made Crix's combat instincts scream warnings his rational mind couldn't quite process. Chains covered the creature from head to toe. Not simple restraints, but works of art forged from materials Crix couldn't identify. They pulsed with their own inner light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. The chains wound around its arms, legs, torso, and throat connected to a collar that bore inscriptions in a script that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. Most disturbing of all was the metal device clamped over its mouth, sealed with locks that radiated an aura of absolute finality. The creature's eyes swept the arena with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing insects. When its gaze fell on Crix, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his capture. Genuine fear. Not the healthy wariness that kept him alive in combat, but something deeper, more primal. His ancestors had known this feeling when they huddled in caves while greater predators stalked the darkness outside. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of all classifications, boomed the arena's announcer, its artificial voice somehow managing to convey uncertainty despite its programming. Today's exhibition match features our undefeated champion Crix of Tarkos against a very special opponent. This creature was recovered from a derelict vessel found drifting in the void wastes 3 cycles ago. No records exist of its species or origin, though preliminary analysis suggests it may be from a previously unknown branch of the evolutionary tree. The crowd murmured uneasily. Discovery of new species was rare enough, but finding one in the lawless void wastes, a region where space itself seemed diseased and normal physics occasionally forgot to function, was unprecedented. Due to the subject's apparent inability to communicate and its volatile reactions to freedom of movement, it has been kept in specialized containment. However, our xenobiologists believe it may possess significant combat potential. The bindings have been modified to allow limited mobility while ensuring spectator safety. Crix felt his combat programming kick in, overriding the primitive fear signals. He had survived by analyzing his opponents, finding their weaknesses, exploiting their blind spots. This creature, whatever it was, had obvious limitations. The chains would restrict its movement, and the mouthguard prevented it from using any natural weapons like fangs or toxic breath. It appeared to have no natural armor, claws, or obvious combat adaptations. The fight began without ceremony. An energy pulse from the arena's control system signaled the start, and Crix launched himself forward with the speed that had earned him his reputation. His plan was simple, and this quickly before whatever made this creature special had time to manifest. He never reached his target, the chain being moved with liquid grace, flowing aside from Crix's charge like water around a stone. But that wasn't what stopped Crix's attack. It was the sound, or rather the complete absence of sound. As the creature moved, reality seemed to bend around it, creating pockets of absolute silence that swallowed even the whisper of displaced air. Crix's claws, which should have torn through empty space with a distinctive whistle, made no noise at all. He stumbled, disoriented by the sensory disconnect, and the creature was already moving again. Despite the heavy chains, it flowed through a series of movements that looked more like a dance than combat preparation. Every gesture was precise, economical, containing no wasted motion despite the obvious constraints. Then Crix realized what was happening to the chains. They weren't just restricting the creature's movement. They were actively fighting against it. Every time it tried to extend its reach or increase its speed, the chains would tighten, pulling it back, forcing it to work within increasingly narrow parameters. But instead of struggling against the restraints, the being was using them, incorporating the resistance into its movements, turning limitation into lethal efficiency. Crix circled warily, trying to process what he was seeing. In his 3 cycles of arena combat, he had faced opponents with energy projection capabilities, natural camouflage, even limited telepathy. But he had never encountered anything that moved like this creature. It wasn't just the physical grace, though that was undeniable despite the restrictions. It was the intelligence behind every gesture, the way it seemed to be calculating not just Crix's position and momentum, but the exact tensile strength of its own chains, the precise angle of the arena's lighting, even the atmosphere pressure and gravity differential. The crowd had begun to murmur again, but their sounds seemed muted, as if the creature's aura of silence was expanding to encompass the entire arena. In the viewing boxes, Crix could see beings leaning forward, their various sensory organs focused intently on the pale figure below. Crix decided to test his opponent's defensive capabilities. He feinted left, then rolled right, coming up with his primary combat claws extended toward what should have been the creature's blind spot. The chain being turned to follow his movement with mechanical precision, but the chains pulled taut across its shoulders, seemingly preventing it from raising its arms high enough to block effectively. Crix's claws were inches from pale flesh when everything went wrong. The creature's hands moved in a blur of motion that the chains somehow couldn't prevent. Instead of blocking Crix's attack, it redirected it, using his own momentum to send him sprawling across the arena floor. But the redirection had been too gentle, too controlled. Crix realized with growing unease that his opponent had been holding back, that the chains weren't the only thing restricting its capabilities. He rolled to his feet and charged again, this time varying his approach pattern, using the combat algorithms that had served him well against dozens of opponents. The result was the same. Every attack was deflected or redirected with minimal apparent effort. Worse, each exchange was teaching his opponent more about his fighting style, his reflexes, his preferred angles of attack. After the seventh failed assault, Crix paused, breathing heavily while his opponent stood motionless in the center of the arena. The creature's expression was unreadable behind the metal mask, but its eyes held something that might have been patience. Or pity. The crowd was growing restless. Combat in the arena was supposed to be brutal, decisive, spectacular. This methodical dismantling of their champion's attacks was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Some were calling for more action, others for different weapons to be introduced. A few of the more sophisticated spectators were calculating odds with increasing nervousness. In the special viewing box that had remained empty for so long, Crix noticed movement for the first time. A figure had appeared there, tall, robed, with features hidden beneath a deep hood. Unlike the other spectators, this one wasn't watching the fight. Instead, it seemed to be studying the chained creature with the intensity of a researcher examining a particularly interesting specimen. Crix tried a different approach. Instead of direct assault, he began moving in a wide circle around his opponent, looking for patterns in the chain configuration, weak points in the binding system, anything that might give him an advantage. The creature turned to follow his movement, but made no aggressive moves of its own. It was waiting for something, though Crix couldn't determine what. Then, he noticed the collar around the creature's throat was beginning to pulse with increasing frequency. The inscriptions on its surface were glowing brighter, and there was a sound like distant thunder coming from somewhere deep within the arena's infrastructure. In the viewing boxes, several spectators had risen from their seats, their postures suggesting alarm rather than excitement. The hooded figure in the special box had moved closer to the transparent aluminum barrier, its attention now focused entirely on the arena floor. When it raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of acknowledgement, the chained creature's head turned upward for the first time since entering the arena. Even through the metal mask, Crix could sense something changing in his opponent's demeanor. The patient stillness was being replaced by something else, something that made the air itself feel heavy with potential violence. The chains were beginning to smoke where they touched the creature's pale skin, and the silence that surrounded it was deepening, becoming almost solid in its intensity. Crix realized he was no longer looking at a restrained opponent being exhibited for entertainment. He was looking at something that was about to break free from restraints that weren't meant to hold it indefinitely. And when that happened, the careful control and gentle redirections would end. The arena's emergency systems apparently reached the same conclusion. Warning lights began flashing along the perimeter of the fighting pit, and automated announcements started cycling through evacuation procedures in 17 different languages. But the spectators were too mesmerized by what they were witnessing to pay attention to mere safety protocols. The creature moved again, but this time the chains didn't restrict it. They stretched, links popping under stress that shouldn't have been possible for organic muscle to generate. The metal collar around its throat was beginning to crack, hairline fractures spreading across the inscribed surface as whatever power had been used to forge it slowly failed. Crix backed away, every instinct screaming that he was about to face something beyond his experience or capability. In the viewing boxes, the more experienced combat enthusiasts were already heading for the exits. They had seen enough death matches to recognize when a situation was about to escalate beyond entertainment into genuine disaster. But the hooded figure in the special box remained motionless, watching with what seemed like professional interest as the most dangerous thing in the galaxy slowly awakened to its own power. The last thing Crix remembered thinking before the creature's restraints failed completely and the real fight began, was how perfectly silent the arena had become. Even his own heartbeat seemed muted, as if reality itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to be unleashed. In the deathly quiet that preceded the storm, one word echoed through the arena's communication system, spoken by the hooded figure in a voice that carried the weight of authority and the chill of recognition. Reaper. The chained creature's head snapped up at the sound, its eyes finding the source of that single, impossible word. And, for the first time since entering the arena, it began to struggle against its bonds not with patience, but with purpose. The moment the word Reaper echoed through the arena, everything changed. The chains that had bound the pale creature for cycles didn't simply break, they disintegrated. Links that had been forged from materials unknown to galactic science turned to powder that glittered like dying stars as it fell to the arena floor. The collar around its throat cracked with a sound like breaking worlds, and the metal mask that had sealed its mouth split down the middle, falling away in two perfectly symmetrical pieces. Crix had faced death before. Every gladiator understood that each match might be their last, that survival was measured in heartbeats and the width of a claw. But what stood before him now wasn't death. It was something far more fundamental, more absolute. It was the end of everything he understood about the universe. The creature that had been bound and silent now stood freely for the first time in cycles, and the transformation was horrifying in its completeness. Its pale skin seemed to drink in the arena's harsh lighting, becoming something between translucent and luminous. Its limbs, no longer restricted by chains, moved with fluid precision that made Crix's earlier assessment of grace seem laughably inadequate. But it was the face, finally, revealed, that made spectators throughout the arena begin screaming in languages that predated their current evolutionary forms. The features were humanoid in the broadest sense, but wrong in every detail that mattered. The bone structure was too sharp, too angular, as if someone had taken the concept of a face and refined it past the point of comfort into something that existed purely for function. The eyes were pale, almost colorless, but they held depths that suggested intelligence so far beyond normal parameters that looking into them was like staring into the heart of a collapsing star. When the creature opened its mouth for the first time since its binding, no sound emerged. But the silence that flowed out was different from the quiet that had surrounded it before. This was active silence, aggressive silence, the kind of quiet that devoured sound rather than simply existing in its absence. The arena's acoustics, designed to amplify every clash of claw and cry of pain, suddenly failed to function. Even the emergency alarms were muted to whispers. In the viewing boxes, panic was beginning to set in. The ethereal lords, beings who fed on strong emotions, were writhing in what might have been ecstasy or agony. It was impossible to tell which. The bruiser delegates were backing away from the transparent barriers, as if the material might not be sufficient to contain what they were witnessing. Even the hive queens, with their distributed consciousness and calculating nature, were emanating distress pheromones that filled their section with a sharp scent of fear. But the hooded figure in the special box had moved forward, pressing against the barrier with what seemed like anticipation rather than alarm. When it spoke again, its voice somehow carried through the aggressive silence that surrounded the newly freed creature. "I know what you are," the figure said, and there was something like relief in its tone. "I know who you were before they found you drifting in that ship, before they bound you and took your voice and tried to make you into something safe." The pale creature turned its attention upward, fixing those terrible, intelligent eyes on the hooded speaker. For a moment, the two beings regarded each other across the space of the arena, and Crix felt like he was witnessing something that transcended mere communication. This was recognition, acknowledgement of shared knowledge that excluded everyone else in the vast complex. "They called you human once," the figure continued, and the word hit the arena like a physical blow. before the war, before the burning of the colonies, before the galaxy learned that some species are too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely. Human. Critics had heard the term before, but only in historical contexts, academic discussions of extinct species, and failed colonies. According to the official records, humans have been a minor spacefaring race that had achieved faster-than-light travel relatively late in galactic history. They had established a few small colonies in unclaimed systems before internal conflicts, and resource limitations had led to their civilization's collapse. The last confirmed human settlement had gone dark over a century ago. The species presumed extinct or reduced to pre-technological levels on some forgotten world. But, looking at the creature that now stood unbound in the arena, critics realized the official records have been carefully edited. This was no failed colonist or primitive survivor. This was something that had been deliberately hidden, contained, removed from galactic knowledge because its existence posed a threat that the combined civilizations of the hegemony couldn't afford to acknowledge. The pale figure spoke for the first time, and its voice was like winter wine through empty spaces. You know my name. The words weren't loud, but they carried through the aggressive silence with perfect clarity. They bypassed the ears entirely, seeming to resonate directly in the consciousness of everyone who heard them. Several spectators in the lower viewing boxes collapsed, their nervous systems overwhelmed by contact with a mind that operated on frequencies their biology wasn't equipped to process. "I know many names for you," the hooded figure replied. "The files call you Specimen 77 Alpha. The Void Priest who found your ship named you Silent Death. The researchers who studied your bindings refer to you as Project Containment. But those who fought alongside you, before the end, they called you something else." The pale creature tilted its head with mechanical precision, waiting. "They called you Marcus. Marcus Chun, Sergeant, Human Colonial Defense Force. Designation, Psychological Warfare Specialist. And after the Battle of Kepler's Gate, when you walked through 3 divisions of hegemony ground forces without firing a shot, they gave you a new name. They called you Reaper." The name hung in the air like a curse, and suddenly, critics understood why the arena had fallen into unnatural quiet. This wasn't just any human. This was one of the legendary human Reapers, the psychological warfare specialists who had turned the tide of battles through fear alone. The stories said they could break enemy morale simply by appearing on the battlefield, that their presence was so fundamentally wrong that opposing forces would surrender rather than face them in combat. Critics had always assumed those stories were propaganda, exaggerations designed to make humanity seem more threatening than a species of bipedal mammals had any right to be. Now he realized the truth was far worse than the legends. Marcus, the Reaper, smiled, and the expression was somehow more terrifying than any display of fangs or claws critics had ever witnessed. It was a purely human expression, recognizable across species boundaries, but performed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what effect it would have on observers. "Marcus Chun died at Kepler's Gate," he said, his voice still carrying that winter wind quality that made reality seem thin around the edges. What survived was something else. Something the hegemony couldn't kill, couldn't contain, couldn't understand. So they did what they always do with problems that don't have simple solutions. They locked it away and pretended it didn't exist. The arena's defensive systems finally responded to the escalating situation. Energy barriers designed to contain the most violent combat scenarios snapped to life around the fighting pit, creating layers of protection between the arena floor and the spectators. Automated weapons systems emerged from hidden panels in the walls, targeting arrays locking onto the pale figure who had spoken a name that wasn't supposed to exist. Marcus looked up at the weapons with the mild interest of someone examining a curious but ultimately harmless insect. When he moved, the motion was too quick for Crix's enhanced reflexes to follow. One moment he was standing in the center of the arena. The next, he was pressed against the energy barrier directly below the special viewing box where the hooded figure waited. The barrier sparked and flickered at his touch, energy patterns that should have been stable dissolving into chaotic spirals of light. The material wasn't failing. It was being convinced to fail, reality itself bending around the simple fact of his presence. "You came here looking for me," Marcus said, and though he spoke quietly, his words carried to every corner of the arena. "The question is why? The human colonial defense force has been extinct for over a century. The war is over. The colonies are ash. What could you possibly want with a Last Reaper?" The hooded figure reached up and pulled back its covering, revealing features that made several spectators gasp in recognition. It was Valen Thorn, one of the most notorious information brokers in the galaxy, a being who traded in secrets that governments would kill to suppress. But there was something different about his expression, something that suggested this wasn't just another business transaction. "Because the war isn't over," Thorn said, his voice carrying clearly through the failing barrier. "It never ended. It just moved underground, became something else. The hegemony has been hunting for the remaining human settlements for decades, tracking down survivors, ensuring the extinction is complete. But they missed something. They missed the children." Marcus went very still, and the temperature in the arena seemed to drop several degrees. "The children are dead. I watched the orbital bombardment myself. Kepler's Gate was the last human world. The last official human world," Thorn corrected. "But there were others. Secret colonies, hidden settlements, research stations and systems so remote they don't appear on any star chart. Some of them survived the initial purge. Some of them are still out there, still fighting a war the galaxy thinks ended generations ago." The energy barrier finally failed completely, dissolving into sparks that fell like metallic snow. Marcus stepped through the empty space where it had been, moving with the fluid precision that marked him as something beyond normal physical laws. Around the arena, spectators were fleeing in earnest now, their entertainment having transformed into something that threatened their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. But Crix remained frozen in place, not from courage, but from the simple understanding that running would be pointless. Whatever this creature was, human, Reaper, psychological warfare specialist, it had already demonstrated that normal concepts like distance and barriers meant nothing to it. If it decided he was a threat, no amount of speed or cunning would save him. "Show me," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, a quality that might have been hope, if hope could be weaponized and turned into something sharp enough to cut reality. "Show me proof that any of them survived." Thorn reached into his robes and withdrew a small data crystal, its surface covered with encryptions that hurt to look at directly. Transmission intercepts from the void wastes. Communications using old human military codes. They're fragmentary, broken, but the patterns are unmistakable. Someone out there is still using colonial defense force protocols. Marcus took the crystal with movements that seemed almost reverent, his pale fingers closing around it with infinite care. For a moment, his expression showed something that might have been grief or joy or some emotion that existed between the two. "How long?" he asked. "The intercepts date back 18 months, but there are gaps, inconsistencies. Whoever is sending them is being very careful, using techniques that suggest they understand the level of surveillance the hegemony maintains in those sectors. They're hiding." Marcus's voice held a note of pride that was distinctly, recognizably human. "Good. That means someone taught them properly. That means the training protocol survived, even if nothing else did." The arena was nearly empty now, but the automated systems were still active, still trying to process what they were witnessing. Security drones hovered at the edges of perception, their sensors recording everything for analysis by intelligence services that would spend months trying to understand what they had captured. Marcus looked up at the remaining observers, his pale eyes sweeping across beings who represented the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. When he spoke, his voice carried a promise that transcended language barriers and species differences. "You made one mistake," he said, and each word fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. "You thought that binding me, silencing me, keeping me locked away would make me safe. But you had it backward. The chains weren't protecting you from me. They were protecting me from what I become when I remember who I used to be. He crushed the data crystal in his hand, and the fragments glowed with their own inner light as the encrypted information flowed directly into his consciousness. Whatever he found there caused his expression to shift, becoming something that belonged on battlefields rather than in civilian spaces. "Crix of Tarkos," he said, turning his attention to the gladiator who had been forgotten in the larger drama unfolding around them. "You fought well. You showed honor in combat, and restraint when victory seemed impossible. Those are human virtues. Would you like to earn a new name to go with them?" Crix realized he was being offered a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He could remain a gladiator, fighting for the entertainment of beings who viewed him as a curiosity, or he could follow this impossible creature into something larger and more dangerous than anything the arena had ever contained. "What name?" he heard himself ask. Marcus smiled again, but this time the expression held warmth alongside its terrible precision. "Survivor. Because that's what you'll need to become if you're going to help me find the children, and remind the galaxy why the human colonial defense force never officially surrendered." The last thing Crix saw before everything changed was Thorn pressing something into Marcus's hand, a device that looked like a standard navigation beacon, but hummed with energies that made reality blur around its edges. When the Reaper activated it, space itself seemed to fold in on the arena, carrying them away from the entertainment district and into the vast darkness between stars. Behind them, the abandoned arena fell silent in the truest sense of the word, empty of sound and movement except for the whisper of air through broken barriers and the soft chiming of emergency systems that would never again need to contain the most dangerous thing humanity had ever created. The ship that materialized around them bore no resemblance to any vessel in Crix's experience. Its interior was a study in contradictions, surfaces that looked organic but felt metallic, corridors that seemed to extend further than the ship's external dimensions should have allowed, and lighting that came from everywhere and nowhere, creating an environment that was both welcoming and deeply unsettling. Marcus moved through the ship with the familiarity of long association, his pale form seeming to flow through spaces that adjusted themselves to accommodate his passage. Crix noticed that doors opened before Marcus reached them, that gravity seemed to shift subtly to make his movements more efficient, that the very air appeared to respond to his presence. This wasn't just a ship, it was an extension of its owner, a tool crafted specifically for someone who existed outside normal parameters. Thorn followed at a respectful distance, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching reverence. He had dealt with dangerous individuals before. Information brokers didn't survive long in his profession without learning to read threats accurately. But this was different. Marcus wasn't just dangerous. He was fundamentally wrong in ways that made reality hiccup around his edges. "How long since you've been free?" Thorn asked, breaking the silence that had settled over them like a living thing. Marcus paused at what appeared to be a navigation console, though the interface bore no resemblance to standard ship controls. Instead of displays and readouts, there were patterns of light that shifted and flowed like liquid thought, responding to gestures that seemed more like dance than data entry. "Time functions differently when you're bound the way I was," Marcus replied, his fingers moving through the light patterns with practiced ease. The chains weren't just physical restraints. They were temporal locks designed to slow my perception, make each moment stretch into eternity. From my perspective, I was contained for approximately 400 subjective years. From yours, it was closer to 3 cycles. Crix felt his understanding of the universe shift slightly. Temporal manipulation technology existed, but it was restricted to the highest levels of hegemony research, used only for the most critical experiments. The fact that it had been deployed to contain a single individual spoke to a level of fear that went beyond ordinary security concerns. "The ship responds to you like it's alive," Crix observed, watching panels reconfigure themselves as Marcus worked. Because it is, in a sense, Marcus said without looking up from his task. Human psychological warfare doctrine required tools that could adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Standard technology was too rigid, too predictable. So we developed something else, ships that could learn, weapons that could evolve, systems that could think. The hegemony called them abominations. We called them necessary. The navigation display shifted, showing a three-dimensional map of local space that included details Crix was certain weren't available to civilian sensors. Stellar positions, gravitational anomalies, hidden asteroid fields, even the patrol routes of hegemony security forces, all of it rendered in perfect detail despite being light years from their current position. The ship is scanning through folded space, Marcus explained, noting Crix's confusion. It can perceive things that haven't happened yet, map territories it's never visited, predict enemy movements before the enemy has decided to move. Human technology, when properly developed, doesn't follow the same rules that govern the rest of galactic civilization. Thorn moved closer to the navigation display, his experienced eye taking in details that would have been classified at the highest levels of government. This level of sensor capability, the hegemony would classify it as a strategic level threat. Possession alone would be grounds for planetary sanctions. The hegemony has spent over a century systematically hunting down and destroying every piece of human technology they could find, Marcus said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of controlled anger. They've classified our entire scientific database as forbidden knowledge. They've convinced the galaxy that humanity was a failed experiment, a species too dangerous to be allowed to develop further. What they haven't admitted is that we were already more advanced than they were when the war began. The ship's interior reconfigured itself around them, walls flowing like liquid to create a new chamber centered around a holographic display system. The technology was unlike anything Crix had ever seen. Instead of projecting images into empty air, it seemed to fold space itself, creating pockets of alternate reality where information could exist in three-dimensional form. Marcus gestured, and the display activated, showing fragments of data recovered from the crystal Thorn had provided. The information was encrypted in patterns that hurt to look at directly, but Marcus seemed to read them as easily as if they were written in plain text. Colonial Defense Force encryption protocols, he said, his voice taking on a quality that might have been hope. But modified, evolved, adapted for long-term clandestine operations. Whoever sent these signals has been developing the technology further, improving on designs that were already decades ahead of anything the hegemony possessed. The fragments coalesced into a rough map of the void wastes, that lawless region of space where normal physics occasionally failed and entire star systems existed in states of quantum uncertainty. Red markers appeared at several locations, indicating the approximate sources of the intercepted transmissions. How many settlements? Marcus asked. Unknown, Thorn replied. The signals suggest at least 3 separate sources, but they could be relay stations rather than actual colonies. The encryption is so sophisticated that even determining the number of senders is largely guesswork. Marcus studied the map with the intensity of someone reading a religious text. Each marker represented not just a potential colony, but the possibility that human civilization had survived in some form despite the hegemony's best efforts at extinction. The nearest source is in the Maelstrom sector, he said, his finger tracing a route through space that avoided known patrol routes and surveillance networks. It's a 3-day journey if we push the ship's stealth systems to their maximum capability. That's assuming the source is still active, Thorn pointed out. The last confirmed transmission was intercepted 4 months ago. For all we know, they could have been discovered and eliminated by now. Marcus turned from the display, and for a moment Crix caught a glimpse of something that transcended the careful control the Reaper maintained over his expressions. It was raw emotion, hope mixed with grief, mixed with something that might have been desperate determination. Then, we'll know soon enough, Marcus said. But If there's even a chance that human children are alive somewhere in the galaxy, then every risk is worth taking. Every danger is acceptable. Every sacrifice is justified. The ship began to move, its passage through space marked not by the vibration and energy signatures that characterized normal faster-than-light travel, but by a kind of selective reality failure that folded distance without technically crossing it. They weren't moving through space so much as convincing space to rearrange itself around them. "Tell me about the war," Crick said as they settled into the journey. "The real war, not the sanitized version they teach in hegemony schools." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on something beyond the ship's hull. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory and the chill of absolute truth. The war began because humanity made two critical mistakes. First, we developed technology faster than the hegemony was comfortable with. Second, we refused to share that technology when they demanded it. What followed was presented to the galaxy as a police action, the civilized races moving to contain a dangerous upstart species before it could threaten galactic stability. The ship's interior dimmed slightly, responding to Marcus's emotional state in ways that suggested a connection deeper than simple technological interface. The reality was different. The hegemony knew that human psychological warfare capabilities represented an existential threat to their authority. Our Reapers could break enemy morale without firing a shot, turn entire populations against their governments, make armies surrender through fear alone. In a galaxy built on the premise that power flows from the barrel of a gun, the ability to make guns irrelevant was too dangerous to be tolerated. Images began appearing in the air around them, not holographic projections, but memories somehow made visible through technology that existed at the intersection of consciousness and reality. Crick saw human soldiers moving through alien battlefields with impossible grace, their very presence causing enemy formations to dissolve in panic. He saw ships that defied conventional physics, weapons that targeted fear instead of flesh, defensive systems that turned attackers' aggression against them. "We were winning," Marcus continued, his voice distant with remembrance. "Not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but because we had learned to fight wars on psychological rather than physical battlefields. We could turn entire sectors against the hegemony without destroying a single planet, could cause governments to collapse through carefully orchestrated campaigns of doubt and fear." The memories shifted, showing the darker side of the conflict. Orbital bombardments that reduced human worlds to glass. Mass executions of captured colonial personnel. Systematic destruction of human technology and cultural artifacts. The deliberate targeting of civilian populations to break the species' will to resist. "So they changed the rules," Marcus said. "Instead of fighting a war they couldn't win, they declared genocide. They convinced the galaxy that humanity was a virus, a plague that needed to be eliminated for the safety of all sentient life. And when reasonable beings objected to the systematic extermination of an entire species, they presented evidence of our capabilities and asked a simple question: do you want them to do to you what they did to us?" The images faded, leaving only the soft lighting of the ship's interior and the quiet hum of systems that existed partially outside normal space-time. Crix found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed, not just the scope of the conflict, but the implications for everything he thought he knew about galactic history. "The last human world fell at the Battle of Kepler's Gate," Marcus said. "I was there. I watched the defense platforms fail, saw the evacuation ships destroyed as they tried to escape. I held position until the very end, using psychological warfare techniques to slow the enemy advance, buying time for the civilian transports. When the orbital bombardment began, I was the only human left alive on the planet." He turned to look directly at Crix, and the gladiator saw something in those pale eyes that he recognized despite never having experienced it himself: survivor's guilt, the weight of being the last of your kind. "The explosion should have killed me," Marcus continued. "The radiation should have destroyed every cell in my body. Instead, it did something else. It changed me, made me into something that couldn't die in any conventional sense. The hegemony forces found me 3 days later, still alive in the ruins of the command center, and realized they had captured something unprecedented, a human reaper who had been exposed to energies that would have destroyed any normal life form. So they decided to study you, Thorne said quietly, to understand what made you so dangerous. Marcus smiled without humor. They tried. For decades, they ran experiments, tests, procedures designed to map my capabilities and find ways to neutralize them. What they discovered was that psychological warfare isn't just a technique. It's a fundamental alteration of consciousness itself. I don't just use fear as a weapon. I am fear made manifest. I don't simply project silence. I exist in the spaces between sounds. They couldn't study me without being changed by the process, couldn't understand me without losing pieces of themselves. The ship's sensors chimed softly, indicating they were approaching the edge of the Maelstrom sector. Through the observation ports, Crix could see the characteristic distortions that marked regions where space-time had been damaged by unknown forces. Stars appeared in impossible colors, gravitational fields flowed like liquid, and there were dark patches where even light seemed reluctant to travel. "Whatever's out there," Marcus said, his attention turning to the navigational displays, "we'll know soon enough. But remember, if we find humans, if we find children who have survived a century of attempted genocide, then everything changes. The war doesn't end with revenge or justice or even victory. It ends with hope. And hope, as the hegemony learned too late, is the most dangerous weapon humanity ever developed." As they entered the Maelstrom sector and began their search for signals that might or might not still exist, Crix found himself wondering what kind of beings could have survived for generations in one of the most hostile regions of known space, maintaining technology and culture while hiding from the combined civilizations of the galaxy. He was about to find out. The settlement appeared on their sensors like a ghost materializing from the quantum foam of damaged space-time. It wasn't built on a planet or asteroid. Instead, it existed in the spaces between reality, anchored to nothing but its own collective will to survive. The structure defied conventional physics, with sections that existed in folded dimensions and others that phased in and out of normal space according to patterns that suggested both defensive necessity and technological mastery beyond anything the hegemony had achieved. "It's beautiful," Crix whispered, watching the impossible architecture flow through configurations that shouldn't have been stable. "It's like they've learned to live inside the laws of physics instead of being bound by them." Marcus studied the sensor readings with an expression that cycled through disbelief, hope, and something approaching reverence. The settlement bore all the hallmarks of human technology, but evolved, refined, pushed beyond the limitations that had existed during the war. This wasn't just survival. This was advancement continued in secret, development that had progressed for over a century without outside interference. "They've been busy," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride that was distinctly paternal. "Look at the energy signatures, the spatial distortions. They've not only maintained the old technology, they've improved on it. This settlement exists partially outside normal time flow. From the outside, it would be nearly impossible to detect unless you knew exactly what to look for." Thorne was running passive scans through his own equipment, comparing the readings to intelligence databases that represented decades of accumulated secrets. "I'm not finding matches for any known settlement patterns. Whatever this is, it's not in any hegemony files. They've managed to remain completely hidden from official notice. The ship's communication systems activated without input from any of them, responding to signals from the settlement that used frequencies and modulation patterns that predated the fall of the human colonial defense force." A voice emerged from the quantum static. Young, cautious, but unmistakably human. "Unknown vessel. You are approaching a restricted area. Identify yourself and state your intentions or alter course immediately. This is your only warning." Marcus moved to the communication panel with movements that seemed almost reverent. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that transcended military rank or official position. This was the voice of someone who had earned the right to command through sacrifice and survival. This is Marcus Chun, Sergeant, Human Colonial Defense Force, Psychological Warfare Division. I carry proper identification codes and am requesting permission to approach. I have information regarding other potential human settlements and need to speak with your leadership immediately. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with implications that stretched across generations. When the voice returned, it carried a different quality, younger, more uncertain, as if the speaker was suddenly confronting the gap between historical records and living reality. Stand by for verification. Maintain position and prepare for escort approach. Any deviation from a signed flight path will be considered hostile action. 3 ships materialized from the quantum distortion surrounding the settlement, and their design made Crix's breath catch in his throat. They were clearly human in origin, but had been developed along lines that deviated radically from any known technological progression. The whole seemed to shift and flow like living tissue, their surfaces covered with patterns that suggested both organic growth and deliberate engineering. They moved through space with fluid grace that reminded him uncomfortable of Marcus himself. Too precise, too efficient, too perfectly adapted to their environment. Experimental designs, Marcus murmured, studying the escort vessels with professional interest. They've been working with biotechnological integration, probably trying to create ships that can think and adapt independently. It's a logical development for a population that needs to remain hidden. Conventional technology can be detected and tracked, but bioships would be nearly impossible to distinguish from natural phenomena. The escort formation guided them through approach corridors that existed more as suggestions than actual paths, threading between spatial distortions that would have torn apart conventional vessels. As they drew closer to the settlement, Crix began to appreciate the true scope of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a hidden colony, it was an entire civilization that had been growing in secret, developing technology and culture without outside interference. The docking bay that opened to receive them was a marvel of engineering that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. As their ships settled into the allocated space, Crix noticed that the bay reconfigured itself around their vessel, creating perfect environmental seals without any apparent mechanical interfaces. Quantum adaptive architecture, Marcus explained, noting his fascination. The structure reads the requirements of incoming vessels and adjusts itself accordingly. It's more efficient than traditional docking systems and leaves no energy signatures that could be detected by long-range scanners. They were met by a reception committee that demonstrated the full scope of what human civilization had become during its century of hidden development. The individuals who greeted them showed obvious signs of genetic enhancement, improved reflexes, enhanced sensory organs, modifications that allowed them to exist comfortably in environments that would have challenged baseline humans. But more striking than their physical adaptations were their eyes, which held depths of knowledge and determination that spoke to generations of struggle and survival. The leader of the reception committee was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, but whose eyes suggested far more experience than her apparent age should have allowed. She wore clothing that seemed to be woven from light itself, materials that shifted between transparency and opacity according to environmental conditions. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical cadences that marked someone raised in artificial environments where every sound had been carefully engineered for maximum efficiency. "Sergeant Chun," she said, and there was wonder in her voice alongside careful caution. "I'm Commander Sarah Vance, current leader of Settlement Omega-7. We've maintained your records in our archives, but seeing you here, it's like meeting a legend that decided to become real." Marcus stepped forward with movements that seemed designed to project calm authority rather than potential threat. Despite his obvious capabilities, He was being careful not to activate whatever psychological warfare systems made him so dangerous, keeping his presence contained to purely human ranges. "Commander Vance," he replied, offering a military salute that belonged to an organization that had been officially extinct for over a century. "I'm impressed by what you've accomplished here. The settlement, the technology, the simple fact that you've remained hidden for so long. It's beyond anything we hoped for during the war." Sarah returned the salute with precision that suggested military traditions had been carefully maintained despite generations of isolation. "We've had good teachers." The original settlers included several Colonial Defense Force veterans who made sure certain knowledge was preserved. "Your psychological warfare protocols, in particular, have been essential to our survival." She gestured toward the settlement's interior, inviting them to follow her through corridors that seemed to extend and contract according to traffic patterns. As they walked, Crix noticed that the architecture responded to their movement, optimizing itself for the group size and walking speed. This wasn't just adaptive technology, it was genuinely intelligent infrastructure. How many settlements?" Marcus asked, his voice careful neutral. "How many survivors?" Sarah's expression showed the weight of secrets that had been carried for generations. 14 confirmed locations. Maybe others that have chosen complete isolation over communication networks. "We estimate a total population somewhere between 50 and 70,000, spread across systems that don't appear on any hegemony charts." The numbers hit Marcus with visible impact. 70,000 humans, when the galaxy believed the species to be extinct. Children who had never seen their original homeworld, adults who had spent their entire lives in hiding, generations who had grown up with the knowledge that their very existence was considered a threat to galactic security. They entered what appeared to be a command center, though the technology bore little resemblance to military installations from the war era. Instead of rigid control stations and tactical displays, the room contained flowing interfaces that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human consciousness could access directly. Personnel moved through the space with a fluid efficiency that Marcus recognized from his own unit, but refined, perfected through generations of practice. "Show him," Sarah said to one of her technicians, and the central display activated to show a three-dimensional map of human settlements scattered throughout the void wastes. Each location was marked with details about population, technological capabilities, and defensive status. What emerged was a picture of a civilization that had not just survived, but had thrived in secret, developing along lines that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. "We've maintained communication networks," Sarah explained as the display zoomed in on individual settlements. "Quantum encrypted, undetectable by hegemony sensor arrays. Information sharing, technological development, cultural exchange. We're not just survivors hiding in the dark. We're a functioning civilization that happens to exist outside official recognition." Marcus studied the display with the intensity of someone seeing hope made manifest. Defensive capabilities? Sarah's smile carried an edge that would have been recognized by any veteran of the Psychological Warfare Division. "We learn from the best. Every settlement is protected by systems that combine conventional defenses with psychological warfare techniques. Any force attempting to attack us would find themselves facing fears they didn't know they possessed, fighting enemies that exist as much in their minds as in physical reality." "And if the hegemony discovers you?" Thorne asked, speaking for the first time since their arrival. "Then they'll discover that a century of secret development has given us capabilities they can't anticipate," Sarah replied. "We're not the same species they tried to exterminate. We've evolved, adapted, become something that exists in the spaces between their understanding of what's possible and what's necessary." Marcus turned from the display to face Sarah directly, and Crix saw something pass between them. Understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement of shared purpose that transcended individual objectives. "I need to ask a favor," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect the future of human civilization. "There are others out there. Individuals like me who were captured, contained, scattered across the galaxy. If we're going to do this, if we're going to reveal ourselves and reclaim our place among the stars, we'll need every advantage we can get. Sarah nodded, as if she had been expecting this request. We've been tracking the locations of captured humans for decades. Soldiers, civilians, researchers, anyone the hegemony deemed too valuable to execute immediately. Most are held in facilities that are supposed to be impregnable. Supposed to be, Marcus repeated, and his smile carried implications that made the temperature in the command center seem to drop several degrees. But they weren't designed to contain people who have had a century to think about escape, who have had time to perfect techniques that were already beyond normal understanding. The display shifted to show a new map. This one marking hegemony detention facilities, research installations, and black sites where humans might be held. The scope was staggering, suggesting a systematic effort to capture and study human capabilities that had continued long after the official end of hostilities. How many? Marcus asked. Unknown, Sarah admitted, but we estimate hundreds, possibly thousands, scattered across the galaxy, held in facilities that most governments don't officially acknowledge. If we could coordinate simultaneous rescue operations, we could announce our return in a way that the galaxy couldn't ignore or suppress, Marcus finished. Not as refugees or survivors, but as a force that never truly surrendered. He turned to address everyone in the command center, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to lead through sacrifice and survival. The time for hiding is ending. The galaxy is about to remember what it means to be human. And when that happens, when they realize that their attempt at genocide not only failed but created something far more dangerous than what they tried to destroy, then the real war begins. In the quantum adaptive walls around them, energy patterns began to shift in response to the collective emotional state of the assembled humans. The settlement itself seemed to be awakening to the possibility that a century of secret preparation was about to bear fruit. The last phase of human survival was ending. The first phase of human resurgence was about to begin. 6 months after the discovery of Settlement Omega-7, the galaxy learned that some ghosts refused to stay dead. The liberation began simultaneously across 47 star systems, executed with precision that demonstrated a level of coordination the hegemony had deemed impossible. At research facilities, detention centers, and black sites scattered throughout civilized space, beings that had been classified as extinct began systematically dismantling the infrastructure of their own imprisonment. Marcus stood on the bridge of the vessel that had once been his prison ship, now converted into something the original designers never could have imagined. The transformation hadn't required significant modifications to the hull or propulsion systems. Instead, the changes had been made to reality itself, convincing the ship that it was something other than what its blueprints insisted it should be. Status report, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quantum communication network that connected all liberated human forces. Facility Gamma 9 secured, came the first response, transmitted from a research installation in the Helix Nebula. 17 researchers recovered, including Dr. Elizabeth Torres. The guards never realized they were under attack until their weapons started refusing to function. Installation Black 7 neutralized, reported another voice from across the galaxy. The detention blocks have been evacuated. No hegemony casualties. They've been convinced that the facility never existed in the first place. The paperwork is already being filed to have it officially removed from all records. Marcus smiled, and the expression would have been terrifying if anyone hostile had been present to witness it. This was psychological warfare on a scale that the original Colonial Defense Force could never have achieved. Not the destruction of enemy forces, but the systematic erasure of their ability to comprehend what was happening to them. Beside him, Crix watched the tactical displays with a mixture of admiration and unease. The gladiator had adapted to his new role as liaison between human forces and the few non-human allies they had managed to recruit, but he still struggled to understand warfare that targeted perception rather than physical reality. How many facilities remain? Crix asked. According to our intelligence networks, 38 major installations and approximately 200 smaller detention sites, Marcus replied. But the numbers are decreasing rapidly. Each liberation operation provides us with new information about hegemony containment protocols, which we're using to refine our approach for the remaining targets. The communication network carried reports from across known space, each one documenting the systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that had been used to study and contain human survivors. But what made the operations truly extraordinary wasn't their scope, it was their methodology. The humans weren't simply breaking their people out of prison. They were convincing the galaxy that those prisons had never existed in the first place. Bridge, we're receiving a priority transmission from Settlement Command, announced the ship's communication officer, a young woman whose genetic modifications allowed her to interface directly with quantum communication arrays. Commander Vance needs to speak with you immediately. Sarah's image materialized in the center of the bridge, projected through technology that made her appear solid and present despite being thousands of light years away. The settlement leader's expression carried a mixture of excitement and concern that suggested significant developments. Marcus, we've detected massive mobilization across multiple hegemony fleets, she reported without preamble. They're finally beginning to understand that something systematic is happening to their detention facilities. Intelligence indicates they're preparing for what they're calling Operation Clean Slate, a comprehensive response to what they classify as an unknown threat to galactic security. Marcus considered this information with the calm detachment that had made him one of the most effective psychological warfare specialists in human history. The hegemony's response was both predictable and inevitable. Faced with an enemy they couldn't understand, they would resort to the tactics that had served them during the original war against humanity. Force projections? He asked. Significant, Sarah admitted. They're mobilizing assets from across the galaxy, including ships and technologies that haven't been deployed since the final battles at Kepler's Gate. They appear to be preparing for the possibility that humanity has returned as a unified threat. Good, Marcus said, and his tone carried implications that made even the ship's advanced AI systems hesitate in their calculations. Then, it's time for them to discover exactly how correct that assessment is. He gestured to the tactical display, which expanded to show the current disposition of human forces throughout the galaxy. What had begun as scattered rescue operations had evolved into something far more comprehensive, a coordinated revelation that was designed to announce humanity's return in terms that the galaxy couldn't ignore or rationalize away. Signal all settlement commanders, Marcus instructed. Implement Revelation Protocol. Phase 2 begins immediately. The communication network carried his orders across the hidden human civilization, reaching settlements and ships that existed in the spaces between official reality. What followed was a transformation that had been planned for generations, prepared for by beings who had spent their entire lives waiting for the moment when hiding would no longer be necessary. Across the galaxy, human settlements began emerging from the quantum shadows where they had existed for over a century. Not all at once, and not in ways that would trigger immediate defensive responses, but gradually, systematically, like dawn-breaking overworlds that had forgotten the sun could rise. The first to notice were the deep space survey teams, explorers, and researchers who worked in the empty spaces between major stellar systems. They began reporting anomalous readings from regions that had been classified as empty void for decades. Energy signatures that suggested massive structures, gravitational distortions that indicated the presence of artificial constructs, even occasional visual contact with ships that didn't match any known design parameters. But when investigation teams were dispatched to verify these reports, they found nothing. The anomalies would fade just before official sensors could record them, leaving only confused personnel and equipment readings that suggested the investigators themselves might be suffering from some form of collective hallucination. Phase 2 is proceeding according to schedule, Sarah reported from Settlement Command. We're generating exactly the right level of uncertainty, enough to convince the authorities that something significant is happening, but not enough for them to mount effective countermeasures. Marcus nodded, watching the tactical displays track the psychological impact of the Revelation campaign across hegemony space. Fear was a useful weapon, but confusion was often more effective. An enemy who knew what they were fighting could develop appropriate responses. An enemy who couldn't determine whether their perceptions were reliable would begin to doubt everything, including their own ability to assess threats accurately. Status of liberated personnel, he asked. Integration proceeding smoothly, came the response from multiple settlements. The recovered individuals are adapting to our technology and social structures. Many are requesting assignment to active operations. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire operation. Humans who have been held in captivity for decades, subjected to experiments and interrogation techniques designed to break their spirits, were not emerging as broken victims. Instead, they were demonstrating resilience that surprised even their rescuers, adapting to a century of technological and social development with speed that suggested psychological flexibility far beyond normal parameters. Psychological warfare conditioning. Marcus explained when Crix expressed amazement at the recovery rates. Everyone in the Colonial Defense Force received training designed to preserve core identity under extreme stress. The techniques we developed weren't just about affecting enemy psychology. They were about protecting our own people from having their minds altered or destroyed by hostile action. The bridge's primary display shifted to show real-time intelligence gathered from across hegemony space. Government facilities were increasing security protocols. Military commands were issuing warnings about potential terrorist activities. Intelligence services were scrambling to understand reports that seemed to indicate the presence of technologies that officially didn't exist. But most telling were the psychological profiles being generated by hegemony analysts. They were beginning to recognize patterns in the confusion, similarities between seemingly unrelated incidents that suggested coordinated action by an unknown force. And those patterns were triggering institutional memories that reached back to the original war against humanity. They're starting to remember, Marcus observed, watching psychological assessment reports scroll past on his displays. Deep in their institutional consciousness, they're beginning to recall what it felt like to fight an enemy that could attack their perceptions directly. Will they recognize the connection? Crix asked. Some will, Marcus acknowledged. The older intelligence services, the ones that maintain historical records from the war. But recognition and understanding are different things. They remember that humans were dangerous, but they've spent a century convincing themselves that the danger was eliminated. Accepting that we not only survived, but became more dangerous will require them to abandon fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. A new signal appeared on the communication network, this one originating from the outer edges of hegemony space, where the boundary between civilized systems and the void waste created opportunities for the kind of dramatic revelation that Marcus had been planning since his liberation from the arena. This is Deep Survey Station Epsilon 4, came the transmission, carrying the unmistakable overtones of panic beneath professional reporting protocols. We are observing massive spatial distortions approximately 15 light-years from our position. Gravitational readings suggest the presence of a large artificial construct, but visual confirmation is problematic. The transmission continued, describing sensor readings that indicated something the size of a small moon had materialized in empty space, only to phase in and out of detection in ways that suggested technologies beyond current understanding. But what made the report truly significant wasn't the technical data. It was the psychological impact on the survey team. Personnel are reporting shared dreams. The transmission continued, and Marcus could hear the strain in the speaker's voice. Visions of structures that shouldn't be possible, technologies that appear to be alive, and voices. Voices speaking in languages that our translation systems can't process, but that somehow seem familiar. Marcus closed his eyes, and for a moment his expression showed something that might have been satisfaction or anticipation, or the kind of quiet joy that comes from seeing carefully laid plans begin to bear fruit. Signal Deep Survey Station Epsilon 4, he instructed. Transmit on standard diplomatic frequencies. Use the old colonial defense force greeting protocols. The communication officer's fingers moved across interfaces that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions where thought became action. When the signal was transmitted, it carried more than just words. It conveyed emotional context, psychological preparation, and the kind of authority that came from representing a civilization that refused to accept its own extinction. Deep Survey Station Epsilon 4. This is Marcus Chun, representing the human remnant fleet. We are here to deliver a message to the galaxy, and your station has been selected as the first official point of contact. Please prepare for formal diplomatic communication. The silence that followed the transmission was profound, heavy with implications that stretched back over a century of assumed extinction and forward toward possibilities that no one in the current galaxy had considered possible. When the response finally came, it carried the kind of shock that accompanies the sudden realization that everything you thought you knew about the universe has just been proven wrong. This is Station Commander Torres. Did you just say human? As in the extinct species? That's not possible. Humans were wiped out over a century ago. Marcus smiled, and this time the expression carried warmth alongside its terrible precision. Commander Torres, we're about to prove that extinction is a much more complicated concept than your government wants you to believe. And we're going to do it in a way that ensures the galaxy never forgets the lesson. As human ships began emerging from quantum concealment throughout the galaxy, as settlements revealed themselves in carefully orchestrated displays of technological superiority, as liberated prisoners returned to a civilization that had grown beyond anything their captors could have imagined, one fact became clear to every intelligence service, government body, and military command in known space. The war that had officially ended at Kepler's Gate had never really stopped. It had simply moved into theaters of operation where the enemy couldn't follow, using weapons that couldn't be defended against, fighting battles that the hegemony didn't even realize were happening. And now, after a century of secret preparation, humanity was ready to announce that the real war could finally begin. The galaxy had spent generations believing that some problems could be solved through systematic application of overwhelming force. They were about to discover that some solutions create far worse problems than the original threat ever posed. The Reaper had called his name. The children had answered. And the universe would never be the same.